Hey everybody, it's Dan once again with another Git tutorial video. Today I'm going to be talking about Git aliases and Git clean because I am about to define an alias that uses Git clean, so I figured it'd be a good time to go over it. So let's go ahead and get started. As you know from my previous videos, I do a lot of things in this Hello World repo. It's kind of a basic repo with a handful of files, not much going on. In this repo, a make builds our project, and it just built a binary file called hello. But you don't need to know any of that because today we're just going to be talking about Git aliases and Git clean. So if I do Git status, don't freak out. I've got a couple new files that I'm going to explain in the course of this video, and they are staged in the index, which you can see right here. So what is a Git alias? If you're familiar with a bash alias, it's very similar. It's basically a way to have a shortcut for an action that you do all the time. So for example, I have an alias called GS that is basically Git status because I type it so often. So that's a bash alias. A Git alias is a way to define similar shortcuts within the Git construct. And there's two types of Git aliases. There's global Git aliases and local Git aliases. So a global alias applies to a user space, meaning if you define a global alias, that alias is available across all repositories that user works in. If you define a local alias, it only exists within the concept of that local repository, if that makes sense. So I'm going to show you right here. So the file in which your aliases that are global are defined are in your home directory hidden.gitconfig file. So if we just open this guy up, you'll see that this is also where Git stores things like what's your username, your email. Don't try this. This is not a real email. I mean, go ahead, try it. I don't know who's going to get it. Some guy named Dan at dan.com. You can define, obviously, your editor of choice, your diff tool, merge tool, but there's a section that you can define called alias, and I have a couple aliases here that I'm going to go through in a couple minutes, but before we get into that, I want to show you where local Git aliases are stored. So remember, this is the global Git alias definition in this file. Anything you define in this file, any alias defined here will apply to any repository that you use Git in. But local aliases only apply to a specific repository, and those are kept in the .git/config file of the repository itself. So in this case, hello is the repository. All Git repositories have a .git folder, and all Git folders have a config file. And you might recognize this file because it defines things like other remotes, the origin, if it exists, branch definitions, tracking mechanisms, and you can have a section called alias, which I do. And I've defined a somewhat complicated alias here that I will also go over in this video, so don't freak out about it right now. I just wanted to go over the difference between local Git aliases and global Git aliases. And really, the only difference is where they live and what file, and whether or not they apply globally across all repos or they're specific to a particular repo. So you might imagine that, you know, any alias you might have that could be project specific, you'd probably want to put in your project config file because it might not make sense in the context of another repository. And I'm going to show you an example of that. So if that doesn't make sense, don't worry about it right now. Okay, so let's take a look a little bit closer at this global Git alias that I've defined called Onstage. Now, if you read the Git documentation, this is a very common one that people like to define. They say, if you're not familiar with how you stage a file in the index, take a look at my other videos on the index. But the concept of staging a file and unstaging a file, a stage is usually done through a git add, and an unstage is done through a reset head --, which is only incredibly confusing when you're learning Git, especially as your first SCM tool. But as an example here, you know, my Git status is showing that I have 2 files staged in the index, and because I have that Onstage alias, it's basically telling you right here, if you want to unstage it, you can use git reset head. And I'll just show you that to be thorough. We'll unstage project config. The dash dash is just a separator saying everything after this is a file, so it doesn't say that here, but that's what that means. And if I type git status again, you'll see that it becomes untracked. It's no longer staged. So let's go ahead and undo that. We'll re-add it to the index, and we see it back where we started. I just wanted to show you that because we have defined in our, in our global alias definition, this unstage, which basically does exactly what we did before, we could also have done that. So I could type git unstage project config, and the result is the exact same. So it used to be staged, the unstage made it untracked again. So let's go ahead and undo that. So that's a very, very simple git alias that a lot of people like. I personally don't really use it. But I could see why it makes sense to define this globally. So this second alias I want to show you, this is another global alias, obviously, because it's in this file, is called get super clean. Now, I actually use this all the time in my actual work because I work in a repository that has submodules. If you don't know what a submodule is, please see my earlier videos on that. This project doesn't have a submodule, but this alias basically does exactly what it sounds like. It does a git clean at the top level, and then it does a git submodule for each git clean. So this basically removes all untracked files, even in your submodules. Now, you may be, if you're paying attention closely, asking the question, what is the deal with this exclamation point? If you look at the documentation, there's sort of externally defined commands for aliases use this exclamation point notation. So as an example, this is a very simple find and replace alias, if you will, right? When we type this, when we use it in practice, we type git unstage, and basically all that's happening under the hood, unstage, and then we have some file. Under the hood, it's a simple find and replace, right? So we've defined unstage to be reset head. All it's doing is this. Of course, I shouldn't have the dashes there, but I hope you understand what I mean by that. But in the case of super clean, we're not doing a simple find and replace of text characters, if you will. Instead, we want to execute what's called an external command in their terminology. But all this means is when you do an exclamation point, it's basically going to give you a shell that executes whatever you type after it. So if we wanted to run git super clean as an example in this repository, git status again. Now remember, it's going to delete untracked files. These are new files, but they're tracked because they're in the index. So git super clean removed, well, in this case it only found one untracked file, but if this project had submodules, it would go into those submodules and delete all untracked files as well, which basically gives you a repository as if it were back at the state in which it was cloned at that point in time, if that makes sense. So it won't touch anything that's in your index. That's a git clean mechanism. So now that I'm realizing I'm talking about git clean, I don't have a video on that. Just real quick, git clean takes a number of switches. If you look at the man page, just type man git dash clean, you'll see what each one of these are. But one of these switches, let's just take a look right now, man git clean. Okay, so X is one of the switches we're using, and X says don't use the standard ignore rules, but do still use the ignore rules given. So basically what it's saying is I want you to delete files even if they're ignored. So, and if you don't know what ignored files are, one of my earlier videos covers that. Those are basically files that just, when you type git status, they don't show up even though they're untracked, like a binary file, like the output. So the next one is -D. We do xdf. D is removed untracked directories in addition to untracked files. Yeah, so -F is basically forcible remove. So, if you're familiar with RMRF, it's basically the same concept, okay? So Git super clean is super useful. If you have submodules, I highly suggest defining it. Be careful when you run it, because if you have any untracked files, if you have a style of work where you keep a lot of untracked files, you should really break that habit and add it to the index, because this will delete anything that has not been added to the index or committed. But it is very useful for when you need your project to basically start from scratch, which is very helpful for large projects. Okay, so those were two global Git aliases. Let's talk about the one Git alias that's local. So I've defined it local to the Hello project, and I've called it checkout refs version. So this is really an example of a modified mechanism that I use in my real job, but I modified it here to kind of just show you an example. So the purpose of this alias is, let me back up here. The left is what you want the alias to be called, obviously, and after the right of the equal sign is the definition of the alias itself. Now, in this case, we're actually defining a function f in bash all in one line, which is nasty and really hard to debug. But essentially what it's doing is it's checking the argument that's given to this alias. It expects an argument, and if the argument isn't given, then it'll say no revision given. The idea of this alias is, hey, I want to check out a version of hello.cpp, and I want that to be an untracked file in my directory. So you might ask the question why you'd want to do that, but let me just show you how it works, because I think that'll be a lot more enlightening. Okay, so the alias is called git checkout-refs-version, and it accepts a point in history. So let's open git log and just grab a point in history. We'll pick 2ffb as an example. So we'll run the alias with the argument given as that SHA-1ref. And you'll notice when we do git status that we now have a new file called hello.cpp dot the SHA-1 that we gave it, because that's how we define the alias. Now this lets you, if you wanted to, basically look at a file from any particular ref, branch, SHA-1, whatever, and have it checked out as an untracked file in your repository. Now if you're a Git guru, you may already know there's other ways of doing that, but this is really just serving as an example application. So like I said, this might not be particularly useful to your project, but I really just wanted to show an example of how you set up a Git alias to do pretty much anything you want that you can define in a quick one-line bash script, or you can even do more complicated things if you need to in Python by essentially calling whatever language you need to from this layer. So remember, we've defined this alias as a local Git alias purposefully in .git/config because, and you can probably already figure this out if you were paying attention, that the concepts, because we check out hello.cpp, it doesn't make any sense to have this alias defined globally, because another project probably doesn't have hello.cpp, and the capability you're trying to implement here appears to be very project specific, at least in this example. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you guys is a better way to implement project-specific Git aliases, and we're coming full circle to the files I'd mentioned earlier, the .project config and the setup repo script. So let's take a look at .project config, and I'll show you that in here we simply have the alias that we defined in the previous example in the .git/config, but we're about to implement a better way to carry this alias through the project without needing your developers to actually maintain it locally in their .git config. And so when I say a better way to carry the aliases around, remember when we define this in .git/config, we actually have to go in and edit this file. Well, .git/config is not a tracked file, so in order to implement any alias you want in your project, you're either going to need your users to copy it in there manually or find another approach. And so this other approach is what I'm recommending, that I'm going to show you right here. It's pretty simple. We essentially define the aliases in .project config, and then we establish a link between .projectconfig and .getconfig using a setup repo script, which essentially just creates an include mechanism so that .get/config points to .projectconfig. So if we look at setup repo.sh here, all it's doing, this is just a simple one-liner, where we're saying we want to add to the local git config the replacement of any entry called include path and make it /projectconfig. So if we look at the .getconfig before we run the script, notice that we have the alias we defined earlier. If we run the script now and take a look at the same file, we'll notice that it dropped a new include path. And this include path is simply a way to point to more definitions of config information by saying look in the path /projectconfig. Now that's relative to the .get directory. So we can remove the alias that we've defined because now it's defined in .projectconfig. Save the file, and I'll go ahead and delete this untracked file we created before and then run our alias again to show you that it still works in its new mechanism, and you see the new file there. So now let's go ahead and commit this change so that we can essentially distribute this mechanism to the group. So I'll just make a commit message saying added project specific alias mechanism, setup script, quick commit. You'll see some output related to some git hooks I did in the previous video. No big deal, just go ahead and ignore that. So git status is clean except for our untracked file that we created, and git log --stat will show that we just committed those two files. So now as we propagate these changes throughout our developer base and we need to change aliases, modify how an alias works, as long as they run the setup repo script as a one-time thing, then all users will automatically get the changes. So if we want to add aliases to our project, now that we have this set up, it's as easy as coming in here, adding a new alias definition, committing the change, and having it propagate to the rest of the users, which is cool. The reason I call this .projectconfig instead of .aliasconfig or whatever is because this is a straight git config file. You can put other sections in here that you'd normally see in your global config file. So example, if you want to enforce that your core diff tool is Vim, you could do that for this particular project. Or if you have some specific diff mechanism because you're using a proprietary tool, you can define that here and it will propagate to everybody. So to summarize here, there's two types of git aliases. There are local git aliases that are project specific. Those are defined in .get/config for your project. And there's also the global git aliases, which are not project specific. They apply to all projects, and that's defined in your home directory .getconfig. Looks like I got a typo here. We covered git clean briefly. I don't have a dedicated video for that. I don't think it necessarily warrants it. We use the -xdf switch in this video, which essentially takes your repo back to a freshly cloned state, assuming you have no modifications. Be very super careful using git clean, especially if you have a workflow where you don't stage things in the index or you don't commit often. A git clean can wipe out your work if you are not appropriately adding it to the index or committing it. So just be very careful. Do not complain to me when you accidentally deleted 3 days work. I'm Dan, and I'll see you next time.